Hello Fleet, and welcome to another episode of Captain's Academy with your instructor Chase. And in today's episode, I'm going to be answering a very important question. Which of these modules should I buy? Now, hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll have a good idea which modules are ideally suited for which particular kinds of ship. How I'll be going about structuring this episode today is I'll first be talking about destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, as they share similar modules, and then I'll cover carriers. I'll also be going slot by slot and covering each individual module one by one. Now, in the first slot, you have 4 different modifications if you're playing a gun and torpedo ship. You have the secondary battery modification 1, the AA guns modification 1, the main battery modification 1, and the torpedo tubes modification 1. Now, in the first slot, I generally advise if you're playing a gunship to get a main battery modification 1, because primarily it has a minus 20% chance of a magazine detonation. A magazine detonation is when you have a full HP ship and you get one-shotted from full HP to nothing because your magazine has blown up. And personally, if I'm playing a gunship, any reduction to that from happening is a good thing. So if you're playing a battleship or a cruiser, get this. If you're playing a torpedo ship like a destroyer or a kitakami where torpedo tubes are your life, then get the torpedo tubes modification 1 so your torpedo tubes don't get knocked out easily. And anything you can do to reduce the chances of your torpedo tubes from getting knocked out is of primary importance. The other 2 modifications in the first slot, the secondary battery modification 1 and the AA guns modification 1, aren't really that useful as they only increase the survivability of AI controlled guns and are therefore not as important. The second slot is where things begin to get more interesting as all of these different modules have their own purposes for different kinds of ships. The secondary battery modification 2, for example, gives plus 20% secondary battery maximum firing range and also increases the accuracy of your secondary battery's gunfire. So this particular module will be very useful on ships like the Nagato, which has a plethora of secondary guns. In my Nagato, for example, I like to use this module as it makes any ship that's trying to get close to me, other cruisers or destroyers, face lethal secondary fire, which I don't really have to control, which is fantastic. But of course, if your ship doesn't have the strongest secondary armament, don't get this upgrade module. So for example, the Ibuki, which only has 4 dual 127mm guns, would fare poorly with this upgrade module. The next upgrade module is the AA Guns Modification 2. Now this module increases the AA's firing range by 20%. This is especially useful for all United States Navy cruisers that are intended to be AA escorts. It can also be used on certain battleships that have strong AA, for example the Yamato. The module after that is the Torpedo Tubes Modification 2. Now this is generally good on any ship that has torpedoes equipped. So if you're in a kitakami or a destroyer, this could be very useful. This could also be applied on Japanese cruisers, but generally speaking, Japanese cruisers have strong guns and the torpedoes are a bit of a weapon of last resort. Therefore, if you're playing the Japanese cruisers, it still makes sense to get the Gun Fire Control System Modification 1 instead of the Torpedo Tubes Modification 2, as your main guns are still your primary weapons. This upgrade module is also applicable to the battleships, the American cruisers, and even the American destroyers. Basically, you use this upgrade module anytime you want slightly less dispersion and better accuracy with your shells. The last module is the Main Battery Modification 2. Now the Main Battery Modification 2 slows your rate of fire and gives you a boost to how fast you can turn your guns. This is particularly useful if you're driving a ship with very low turret traverse. So most of the Japanese destroyers, for example, the Russian Tier 5 premium destroyer, the Gremiyashi, and also things like large battleships if you don't mind the decrease in rate of fire. Although in most cases, I would still avoid getting this mod as a battleship's rate of fire is low enough already. Now onto the third slot. The third slot is exclusive to tier 9 and 10 ships, so very few ships in the game will have this slot, but the modifications are nonetheless interesting. The first upgrade module in the third slot is the AA Guns Modification 3, which increases AA mount effectiveness by 20%. Now, once again, I would be using this particular module in combination with the other AA module, which increases range in the second slot. And also, this module is ideally suited for ships with good anti-aircraft armament, thus being the American cruisers and certain battleships. The next module is the Secondary Battery Modification 3, which decreases secondary battery loading time by 20%. Now, this could be useful if this was actually a third slot available for ships like the Nagato, but third slots only happen for ships above tier 9, and at that tier you don't usually get into a range close enough for your secondary batteries to do that much damage, so I would consider this a waste considering the other modules are that much more useful. The next upgrade module is really interesting. The Torpedo Tubes Modification 3 decreases the time it takes to reload torpedoes, but it increases the chances of your torpedo tubes being critically damaged. By quite a bit, mind you, 50% is a big difference there. But the 15% reduction in reload time can be extremely useful for ships like the Shimakaze, which is able to stay invisible due to its long-range torpedoes and low detectability. So the 15% makes a big difference because it lowers the Shimakaze's reload time from, let's say, 3 minutes down to around 2.5 minutes. So this is a module that one has to really think about. The fourth upgrade in the third slot is the Main Battery Modification 3, which increases rate of fire at the expense of turret traverse speed. This module is very useful for ships where the turret traverse speed doesn't affect them that much, for example the Gearing or the Des Moines, which can really also get a very big boost to their damage because of the increased rate of fire. The Gearing, which normally spits out 120 rounds per minute, is now able to manage 136 rounds a minute with this module. The Des Moines goes from 90 to 102 rounds per minute, which gives it a greatly increased damage output. On the other hand, battleships like the Yamato, which could use the boost to the rate of fire, should not use this mod because their turret traverse speed goes from 72 seconds to 84 seconds. Can you imagine turning the Yamato's guns and taking over a minute to do so? The final upgrade module in the third slot is the Gun Fire Control Modification 2, which increases main gun range by 16%. While this doesn't sound like much, it actually makes a huge difference to the ships that can equip this module. Take for example the Yamato, which by default has a 26.6 kilometer range. Throw on this module and the Yamato's range increases to 30.85 kilometers. The Des Moines, which normally has a 15.8 kilometer range, will now have an 18.33 kilometer range with this mod, and the Gearing, with its paltry 11.1 kilometer range by default, increases to 12.88 kilometers, which is actually very good for a destroyer. The fourth slot has 3 upgrade modules: the Damage Control System Modification 1, the Propulsion Modification 1, and the Steering Gears Modification 1. The Damage Control System Modification 1 decreases your chance of being flooded and decreases your chance of being set on fire. The Propulsion Modification 1 decreases the chance of your engine taking critical damage and getting knocked out, and also decreases the time it takes to repair the engine. And finally, the Steering Gears Modification 1 decreases the chances of your steering being knocked out and also decreases the time to repair it. Personally, I recommend getting the Damage Control System Modification for all your larger ships, the cruisers, the carriers, the battleships, while getting the Propulsion Modification for your destroyers, as having your engine knocked out in a destroyer is absolutely lethal. The Steering Gears Modification I would stay away from, as having your rudder knocked out isn't always a death sentence. The fifth slot also has 3 modifications: the Propulsion Modification 2, the Steering Gears Modification 2, and the Damage Control System Modification 2. The Propulsion Modification 2 increases acceleration, the Steering Gears Modification makes you turn a little bit faster, and the Damage Control System Modification 2 decreases the recovery time for flooding and fire. Now typically, I would ever only recommend the first 2, as the Damage Control System Modification 2 can be mitigated by the repair kit. The Propulsion Modification, which increases acceleration, I strongly recommend putting on destroyers, or ships that are pretty fast and are able to maneuver pretty quickly, because it helps you recover speed that you lose while you're turning. The Steering Gears Modification 2 I would recommend putting on ships that don't turn as fast, such as battleships and carriers. The final upgrade slot has 2 upgrades: the Concealment System Modification 1 and the Target Acquisition System Modification 1. The Concealment System Modification decreases your detectability, while the Target Acquisition System increases the range of your radar, at least that's what I believe so far. The Concealment System Modification 1 I would put onto destroyers and cruisers, which would benefit from being a little bit more stealthy and less likely to be spotted by other ships. On the other hand, the Target Acquisition System Modification I would put onto battleships and carriers, as it gives them even earlier warning that enemy planes might be approaching, and thus allow them to take early preventative action. Aircraft carriers and World of Warships have their own unique upgrade modules. In the first slot, you have the Air Groups Modification 1, which increases your aircraft's gun effectiveness by 10%. As this is the only module in the first slot that affects my airplanes, I usually get this one and not the other 2. The second slot, however, is where things get a little bit more interesting. You have the Air Groups Modification 2, which increases your fighter survivability by 20%, and you have the Flight Control Modification 1, which decreases the time it takes to service your aircraft. Now, if I was playing a carrier where my fighters were going to play a big role at intercepting other planes or engaging other fighters, I'll get this air groups modification too, as I want my fighters to be a little bit more survivable. On the other hand, if I'm playing a bomber setup, I will get the flight control modification 1, as it allows me to get my bombers out faster, retrieve them, and then rearm them faster than if I was using the air groups modification 2. The third slot is quite interesting, as it currently only affects the Essex. The third slot has the flight control modification 2, as well as the air groups modification 3. The air groups modification 3 increases the attack aircraft survivability, and the flight control modification 2 gives maximum aircraft speed, another 5% there. So typically on the third slot, you have a choice, and this one's actually very flexible. I like having the extra speed because I want my fighters to be a little bit faster, as the Bearcat is notoriously slow. However, with the heavy AA environment of the higher tiers, you might want to make your attack aircraft a little bit more survivable, as more of them will be able to get to target and release their payloads, and thereby doing more damage to enemy ships. But this one is really up to you. Well, that's all folks. I hope I've been able to explain these upgrade modules and have given you an idea on how to best equip your ship. If you like what I'm doing, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any additional questions, please ask them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Hope you all have a fantastic day, and I'll see you all in the high seas.